Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about inflation, and we're going to talk about it with a good friend to this radio program, economist Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is a renowned Marxist scholar. He teaches at the New School University in New York City. He's the host of the very popular show Economic Update, and he is the co-founder of Democracy at Work. Professor Wolff, great to see you and congratulations. It's my understanding that this past year, you've been marking 10 years of Economic Update, which is a very popular radio program for us anyways on our network.
Yes, thank you very much, Mitch. I'm glad to be in conversation with you again. You deserve a good bit of the credit for everything that Economic Update has been able to achieve, because you very kindly helped us at one point get on a number of radio stations that helped build us. I'm very proud now. We are both a radio program and a television program at the same time. And we go out to a larger number of radio and TV stations than, frankly, I ever imagined I would have access to. So while the situation I try to understand is grim, and becoming grimmer, I must say that the audiences for what I have to say are growing all the time and represent a whole nother development, excuse me, a whole nother development than the one you see celebrated or otherwise referred to in the mass media. And so I like to tell people about this because it offsets an impression that everything is moving to the right. That simply is not the case.
It seems everything's moving to the polls, which you told me and even warned me, to be honest, what was to come after I began talking to you a few years before you started Economic Update with the 2008 crash. And I'll never forget, you told me politics are going to go more to the extreme in both polls.
Yep. Yeah. And we're not anywhere near the end of that process. And that is going on in most of the European countries, in other parts of the world as well. This is a long-term process that I would associate with the decline of an economic system. I think we are at that point, certainly in North America and Western Europe, but that the problems we're seeing are, in fact, very global, and the United States is neither escaping nor evading in any way being caught up in that process.
Did Karl Marx write about inflation, pay attention to inflation? Was inflation an issue in the 19th century during his lifetime?
Yes, Marx talked about inflation. In a way, you have to talk about inflation because of its important role at a number of really key moments of history. Marx was mostly interested in the history of Europe. He was a European, but he was also interested elsewhere. I remember at one point he wrote interestingly about what was called the Great Price Inflation in Europe in the 15th century. So let me immediately answer you by saying it is not a capitalist phenomenon. That is, it isn't peculiar to our kind of economic system. In those days, it had a lot to do with gold. If you remember, the Spanish and the Portuguese, when they made their voyages that quote unquote discovered Latin America as if it hadn't been discovered by the people who lived there, and all of that crazy business. But they came for the gold. They took the gold back to Europe with them. And at first it was on the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish and the Portuguese, but they then used the gold to buy everything they could from the rest of Europe because they suddenly had the means to do so. And that drove up the gold price of everything else that was brought in to Spain. It was the golden era for Spain, but it meant a price inflation. And everywhere in Europe, everything got shaken up because inflations always do that, because they change everybody's calculation about what do I produce. If I'm a farmer, if one price is going up 5 times faster than the next one, I want to shift from producing corn to producing, vegetables, or from vegetables to grapes to make wine, or whatever it is. You're constantly thinking not simply about what to produce in terms of your resources, your skills, the personnel you have. You now have another calculation you have to add, which is, what are the prices of the things I have to buy relative to the price I can charge for what I have to sell? If I don't get that right, no matter what the quality is of my work, no matter what the beauty is of my product, I could be finished because I'm not navigating the wild irregularities that every inflation needs. Remember, an inflation is simply a general rise in prices. Even if you take the one here in the United States today, a gallon of gas has gone up 10 times. A loaf of bread has gone up, 15, 20%, and everything in between. So it's never even, it's never a regular thing. So if you hear, for example, that the November to 2020 to November this year, the rate of price increase is just below 7%. That's an average. It means that every producer is making calculations, because remember, there's always a gap between the time you start a production process to make a chair or to make a software program or even to prepare a hamburger. Between the time you order the hamburger meat and you order all the rest of it and you put it to work and you take it out of the freezer, time passes. And during that time, prices shift. And you've got to guess what all that's going to be weeks or months or even years into the future, which of course nobody can do. And one of the worst things, therefore, about an inflation is that it makes rational calculation in an economy virtually impossible. And it produces one dilemma after another. Let me give you an example here from the United States right now. Most of the media have the relationship in the reverse order. They try to justify or explain inflation because we have supply chain problems. You can't get things produced over there and brought here. Actually, it's mostly the reverse. It's when the inflation happens that every producer begins to say, wait a minute, maybe I should buy more stuff now because prices are going up and hold it in my warehouse rather than what I used to do, which is order it every couple of months, because if I wait a couple of months, I'm going to have to pay 10% more, and that could destroy my profits. So suddenly, just think like with me a moment, suddenly all kinds of producers are calling up their suppliers and saying, I don't want the usual shipment of inputs, raw timber or raw cotton or whatever raw materials I want you to send me an entire year's worth. I'll store it in my warehouse. And so they take a lot of it and they put it in their warehouse and they feel great. But if a half a dozen of the people do that, that supplier is suddenly going to be out of stuff. It's not that the stuff isn't there, but he had to sell it to his buyers who are storing it. Now come the later buyers, they call up, I would like my shipment. Sorry, he says, I don't have any. What do you mean you don't have any? I'm all sold out. And now he gnashes his teeth because what has happened is what the mainstream media will call a supply chain interruption. And then they'll say, see, that causes prices to go up. No, Jack, it's the other way around. It's because prices were rising that supply problems were the next step in how the system adjusted to the inflation. So don't listen to this nonsense in which inflation is explained by the very things inflation causes. a supply chain disruption and an inflation very, very often go together. And disentangling how one of them shaped the other is a fool's errand, because all you're going to find is an endless interactive process that worsens itself as it goes on. If I could say something about inflation, I think would help people understand. Let's begin very simply in economics. If an inflation is a general increase in prices, which everybody agrees that's what it is, let's ask an initial question. Who raises prices in a capitalist economy? And the answer is also universally understood. The employers do that. It is, if you look at your job description, if you've ever been an employee anywhere, it doesn't include setting the price of whatever it is you help to produce. So let's be real clear. The employers, a tiny minority of our society, maybe 1%, maybe 2% of our people are employers of anybody else. The vast majority of us are employees, okay? So the first lesson of inflation is this is something employers do, not employees. The job of the employee is to pay the price that the employer sets. Now, that's not a democratic procedure. We do not democratically vote on what the prices of things should be. We've never done that. We don't do it now. It's not part of an employee's definition of duties. Okay, so now the second question. Why do the employers raise prices? The minute you understand that that's the key question, you immediately, if you're smart, understand that employers, on the one hand, love the power to set prices. If they can get away with setting higher prices, they make more money. I mean, it doesn't take rocket science, but there's a hook, there's a problem, because they are also responsible for raising prices, and they don't like that at all. Why? Because they know the public they're trying to appeal to, the public they need to buy whatever it is they produce, will not be happy to be told that the price of it is going up. We're not happy when suddenly the milk or the potatoes or the ride on the subway or everything goes up. So employers want the power, want to be able to set the prices, enjoy raising them for all the obvious reasons, but now they have to also deal with the fact that they must explain the price increase they've decided to put as if it weren't their fault. Therefore, you will never hear an advertisement that goes like this. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the producer of socks, and I am raising the price of the socks that I produce that you wear on your feet by 20%. And I'm doing it because that will make my business more profitable than it would be if I didn't raise the price. You'll never hear this ad, because that would be a way for this fellow who did that to drive himself out of business. So what does he do? He says nothing. That's one strategy. Or, and here comes the popular one, he blames somebody else. I'm only raising the price because my workers have forced me to pay them more wages. Or my workers aren't working as hard as they should be. Or I have to pay more in taxes to the government. Or I have to spend more on it's an endless litany of blame somebody else, because you don't want to lose customers when you have raised the price. The only way to know whether a price increase set by an employer is intended to increase profits is if you were on the inside of that business, if you were the famous fly on the wall when the decision was made by the owner of the business, by the board of directors, and you heard what they discussed when they reached that decision. We are, in fact, you and I, excluded from those meetings. And therefore, we are in the following weird position. We live in an inflation, and we spend a ridiculous amount of our time, me as an economist, you as a journalist, listening to a litany of excuses, blaming of other people, because the people who actually raise the prices in the inflation do not want to square with us about whether their own profits were a key factor. And the joke of all this, Mitch, is if you go to business school and you get your MBA, and I've taught in business schools, the first thing and the last thing you learn is business exists to make a profit, or profit is our bottom line, or profit is our goal. In other words, in that environment, everybody admits it's about profit. But when it comes to something as important as setting a price, we're told to think about everything other than the drive of he who sets the price to be profitable. It is an amazing program of social self-delusion.
I do want to ask you about wages. Wages have risen in the last year.
Yes.
And we hear this in some places, some states, some local municipalities have raised the minimum wage as well. Oftentimes this is pointed towards having to then raise prices. And you have to raise prices because the wages are up, and able to meet those wages or benefits or whatever it is, you obviously need more money to be able to do that. So you raise prices. And I guess that's just intuitively what people think.
Yeah, but that's a blaming game, right? That's the price setter saying he's only doing it because he's passing on the higher wages he has to pay. So let me explain to you, if I can, why that's a mistake. First of all, let's look at the current numbers. The inflation rate, roughly 7%. The rate of increase of money wages right now, roughly 5%. So the first thing to understand is that if it were the case that you raised prices because of or in some relationship to wages, then there's some miscounting, I'm being polite here, going on, because the people setting the prices are raising them faster than people can set their wages to go up, which means that the average American worker, because it's the averages we're talking about, the average American worker has 5% more money, but everything that average worker buys now costs on average 7% more, which means our workers are falling 2% behind each year. Even as their wages go up, what they can afford to buy with them is decreasing. That is a remarkable thing to do to a working class that has just gone through one of the worst economic crashes in American history and a devastating public health disaster that has cost us 800,000 dead people, and God knows how many people with what illnesses into an indefinite future. To come through that experience and be told, oh, now we're going to hit you with an inflation that raises prices more than wages. I mean, the morality of this alone ought to make everyone stop and take a really deep breath. But it's much worse than all of this. If you do economics properly, you understand that paying the worker is what the employer does to the worker. What about what the worker does for the employer? We have a measure of that. It's called productivity. And what we do is in economics, the government does this, we measure for every hour that an average worker works, how much product is produced. That isn't flat. That's always right. It's been rising for the last century. It rises on average between 1% and 2%. But of course, that's an average. In any given business, it could be 3, 4, 5%, or even more. All right, so now the employer paying the worker the same amount of money is getting 1 or 2% more profit because the worker is more productive. So you don't have to raise the price of your product to make more money. If you leave the price of your product the same and you pay your worker the same, you're going to make more profit because the productivity of that worker is a plus. He's producing or she's producing more for you. Okay, so even if the worker, now let's take the last step of it, pay the worker 1 or 2% more each year. You don't have to raise your price. Your profits are still ahead because in a way, the extra productivity of the worker is what's paying for you to pay him more. Paying the worker more is sharing with the worker the fruits of the rising productivity. If you take that into account now, American workers are becoming at a rate, I would guess, between 2 and 3%, be my guess. I don't know it right now, but it's my guess. Workers' productivity is going up 2 or 3%. So that's already a boost to profits. Plus, they're raising the price of what the workers are more productive and producing. So they're actually gaining 7% plus 2 to 3%. They're in the neighborhood of 10% improvement, but they're giving their workers 5%. All right, so the workers can't afford to buy back what they're producing. Classic problem of capitalism. And I think the minute people sort of understand this, they won't allow the capitalists to do what they are doing, which is simply building their profits faster than they are helping workers afford what they're producing. And then we get the final step in all of this, Mitch, which is really important. If workers can't keep up, what are they going to do? They're going to do one of two things. One, they're simply going to resign themselves to it and lower their standard of living. They'll go from hamburger to hamburger helper. You know, they will do what poor people have always done. Some of them will. Others of them are going to get so angry about this situation, the combination of the crash that made them unemployed for much of last year and this, plus the illness that they suffered, plus the threat of more illness coming, plus, and you know what they're going to do? They're going to have a whole new attitude towards their work. They're going to be angry. They're going to be bitter. We have seen more people quit their jobs this last year than we have seen in decades. They weren't fired. No trauma happened. They said, in the words of that old song, take this job and shove it, right? Because it's too much. And they also go to the two extremes politically. They look for scapegoats. This is black and brown people. This is immigrants. This is China. Whatever huckster can tell them whose fault this is. And there are now a growing number that are striking. Nabisco, Kellogg, John Deere. You're beginning to see the delayed movement of a working class that is beginning to recognize this is too much what's happening to us. They may not be able to put it into the economic language. That's my job. But they feel it and they respond and they act on it. And that's not unusual. In the history of inflations, they have gone on. And when they've gone on, they have provoked the most incredible political changes. And maybe that's an important little historical vignette. In the beginning of the year 1922, for every US dollar, you could exchange it for about 5 or 6 Deutschmark. That was the currency in Germany. A year and a half later, 1923, for $1, you could get, ready, 6 billion Deutschmark. Their currency collapsed. Their inflation meant that prices doubled for periods of a month at a time. Every few hours, the people in the grocery store had to reprice the potatoes or the bread by doubling the price. Workers would take their lunch hour, and instead of having a sandwich, they would run home from the factory or the office or the store, hand off to their husband or wife a bag of money, telling husband or wife, run to the store and spend it, because if you hold it till this afternoon, it won't be worth half of what it's worth now in terms of the bread and the butter and anything else you might be buying. Okay, that destroyed the savings of the German working class and middle class. Germans were then, as they are to this day, very frugal people. They save a lot of money, and they saved. But if prices go very high very quickly, your savings become worthless. People had spent 40 years accumulating a nest egg, which when this inflation hit, would get them a quarter pound of butter for the 40 years of. It blew the minds of the German people. The whole notion of saving was to get you through a hard time, and it had come on them and they were destroyed. All right, this is 1922-23. Within 4 years of that time, the second political power in Germany was a man named Adolf Hitler. And without that inflation of the 20s, there would have been no Nazism in Germany or anything like it.
This would bring down the Weimar Republic.
Yeah, this was all during the Weimar Republic, which couldn't control this inflation, tried to, couldn't. By the way, politicians promise when inflation starts that they always promise two things. We have it under control and it won't last very long. But if you believe that, that's only possible if you've never studied the history, because if you have, you'll know that those are worthless promises. They are people predicting the future, and you should by now understand, and I say this to you as a professional economist, I can't predict the future any better than anybody else can. And if you encounter someone who tells you what the future is, I give you a very, very good piece of advice. Talk to somebody else, because the only person you should listen to who predicts the future is the fortune teller in the country fair. And you should understand that that's an amusement, not a scientific proposition. And nobody knows. And believe me, Mr. Powell, at the head of the Federal Reserve, regrets to the bottom of his shoes having told the American people that the inflation is transitory, as if he knew. The Federal Reserve is just another agency of government. It's full of people every bit as fallible as you and I. It is subject to political pressures way heavier than you and I suffer. And therefore, what comes out of the mouth of those people should be understood in the context of what drives them, and not to give them some imaginary powers of knowing how this inflation is going to play out.
Now, what we had in Germany in the 1920s is commonly referred to as hyperinflation. And we've seen hyperinflation through time, even recent time. I think it was some 20 years ago or so that we saw it in Argentina. How we're not in hyperinflation, even if you're scared about it. How do you go from inflation to hyperinflation? What has to happen to get to hyperinflation?
Usually what has to happen is either an increase in the quantity of money chasing after goods, or a cutback in the available goods so that people are desperate and bid up the prices of things because there just aren't enough things to go around. Usually you look for those kinds of situations. They don't often happen internally. They usually have to be piled on, if you like, externally. So, for example, one of the reasons Germany went into from mere inflation to hyperinflation was because Germany had the bad taste to lose World War I. And as a consequence of having lost World War I, they were saddled with an immense debt. They had to repay the victorious countries, particularly Britain and France, a huge war debt, it was called. And this imposed on the German government an impossible situation. They were being asked by the French and the British, and the Americans got in there too, to use their taxing power to take wealth away from the German people who put that government into office in order to take that wealth and give it to the British, the French, and so on, which meant that the government had very little left to do for the German people what the government was supposed to do, clean the streets, run the schools, etc. So they printed money to be able to try to and that spun right out of control. And often you'll see the transition from inflation to hyperinflation come about when you have a set of internal difficulties, and then on top of that, international. So just to make sure Americans understand we are in that position, let's remember that the United States has the dubious distinction of being the world's #1 debtor country. That is, the United States borrows from the rest of the world more than any other country borrows from the rest of the world. And not only that, the #1 and 2 holders of American debt, the two countries that are our biggest creditor, are Japan and China. And Japan may be a reliable ally. China is being provoked by the United States, as well as having its own issues. And who knows what they're going to do with $1 trillion plus of U.S. debt. What is the government going to do if they want that back? They cash it in. We're not holding this anymore. The United States would have a crisis on its hands of unimaginable importance. I'm not saying it's about to happen, but it would be naive to think that none of that is in question when you do your policy. All of that is swirling around the Federal Reserve, and they're wondering, will they be confronted with such a crisis? Now, China has reasons not to do that. So I'm not saying it's imminent or anything like that, but we have a set of circumstances that mean to think that we will not have an inflation or that it won't go into a hyper level. I mean, that's simply make-believe. 20 years ago, we had, here in the United States, we had an inflation twice the size of what it is now. Okay, that really provoked things. And we had one of the worst catastrophes of crunching down our economy, throwing millions of people out of work as the way we tried to cope in this society with that inflation. All of that can happen tomorrow just as well.
Richard Wolff, I was thinking before we began our chat today, for a while now, you've been saying capitalism is in decline, and even saying it's over. What does over mean?
Yes, wonderful question. Thank you, Mitch. Here's all that I mean. From roughly the 1820s, 30s onward, and particularly after our Civil War, which resolved the split here between the capitalism of the Northeast and the Midwest versus the slavery of the South, once those things were behind us, the American capitalist system had clear sailing to take off, and it did, roughly 1870 to roughly 1970, and so on. We really had a wonderful ride up. We outdistanced Britain. We had started as a small colony of Britain, but now there was role reversal. We were the Colossus, they were the little one. We defeated the two countries that could have contested our role, the Germans and the Japanese. The first one in the Germans in World War I, and then in World War II, the Germans and the Japanese both. And so we emerged at the end of the Second World War, even stronger, King of the Hill, all of that. It's been a great ride up. American workers became the best paid in the world, but everything that goes up must eventually come to an end. Every other successful economy in the world, in the history of the world, has had that experience. It has gone up, and then it was replaced by somebody else who was on the upward trajectory. The trick is not to escape that. That's doesn't look like it's possible, never been done, every empire. The trick is to understand it so that you can make the ride down less divisive, less horrible, less contentious, less driven to war than has been the case before. Remember, the British didn't make it easy for us. We had to have a revolutionary, violent overthrow of the British government in 1775. And we had to fight them again in the War of 1812. This was not a peaceful arrangement, to say the least. So for me, the question is, I think it's over. I think it was over in 1970, 75, 80. It was only sustained a little further by shifting from a society based on real work and payment into a society developed on debt. We have the greatest debt now of the government in our history, of the corporate sector in our history, and of the household sector in our history. We are a society completely dependent on debt. These are all signs. Our inability to prepare for and cope with COVID, that's another sign. It's a sign to us like the Black Plague was a sign to feudalism if they could have understood it back in the 14th century. So for me, I see an accumulation of signs that say we are now down. And the saber rattling 1 month against China, the next month around the Ukraine, these are desperate castings about of a system that hasn't yet come to terms with the fact that it's in the down cycle of its history, and it has to face that and deal with that. Then we can manage it. But pretending not to, telling ourselves every day we're the greatest, we're the greatest, this is childish and not a successful policy.
Richard Wolff, thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Sorry I have to run. Let's do this again and talk about it some more.